I think 9 is important. I don't think it's anti-labor. I think it is anti-corruption, anti-big business, and the influences that are going on in Sacramento. And I think it's a measure that is of importance to the people. And in this age of Watergate, we can do no less than pass that proposition.
Was it Jess Unruh who said, you know, if you can't take their women and drink their wine and vote against them, then you don't deserve to be a politician?
The late, great Joe Remcho, who I'm sure you've probably heard quoted a few times in these interviews, used to tell me, oh, money in politics is like a, air bubble in a carpet. You push it down one way, it pops up the other way.
Money and campaign finance are at the heart of all of those issues and have an impact on it, because it's about whether or not our government is going to be representing the people.
There's the law and there's the spirit. And the spirit of reform has to be forever revivified and nourished if the shell of the rule is to make sense.
The political world of California before the Political Reform Act featured few formal rules. Instead, prominent characters ruled the day. Lobbyists had cozy relationships with members of the legislature, and the public had little to no information about money in politics. Famously, a late 1940s Collier's Weekly article showed the influence of famed lobbyist Artie Samish, who once boasted it was his legislature. He eventually spent 3 years in prison for tax evasion. Sacramento had many legendary venues where political drinks, deals, and meals flowed. The Senator Hotel's location meant it played a major role in many such events. Back in those days, deals made on napkins over drinks at the legendary Frank Fat's or backroom deals at Simon's could be as common as the California sunshine for many in state politics.
Well, it was a lot of fun around here. There was drunken orgies every night paid for by the lobbyists. I think it resulted in fairly good legislation, actually. But that's a little bit of an exaggeration. But the lobbyists did pay for everything. And reporters had no idea who was paying, because they didn't have to report. And although it was a lot of fun and everybody enjoyed themselves and everybody got along very friendly and they built good relationships, once they reduced the spending limit to 2 hamburgers and a Coke, I think it was, $10, and all that stopped.
It was pretty loosey-goosey, to tell you the truth. In fact, I wrote a book about lobbying about 15 years ago, and it gave some of the history of how it was back when. For example, lobbyists would host lavish dinners for politicians, and they had a couple of luncheon clubs. There was one called Moose Milk, for example, another called the Derby Club, because they all wore derbies, and they would meet and they would drink and they would eat, and their lobbyists basically paid for all of that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of wining and dining, I guess you'd say. And funny thing is that campaign contributions weren't such a big deal in those days. The average campaign spent for a legislative office maybe $15,000, $20,000. It was not a big deal. There was not a lot of giving of campaign contributions by lobbyists in those days because you just didn't need that much money to run for election and re-election.
There were lunches and they were paid for by some lobbyist that 100 people would go to. And there was sort of a troupe to the Senator Hotel or one of the other ones where these Tuesday and Wednesday lunches were held. One was called Moose Milk. I think that continued for a number of years, even after the adoption of the Reform Act, and I think the participants had to pay for their lunch or something, but they kept going. I was part of, and my predecessor, sort of a reform crowd that in response to moose milk, they created mice milk, which was their own sort of bag lunch lunchtime thing where they would get together and talk about policy matters, and no one paid for it.
The legislature in those days was a monoculture. It was composed almost entirely of middle-aged white men. There were one or two women, one or two Latinos, one or two African Americans, maybe an Asian now and then. But basically, it was an institution of monoculture. So when you talk about the camaraderie, you have to also factor in that it was kind of like a frat house or a country club thing. It was just that kind of an atmosphere because that was the culture of the place at the time. Senate, for example, did not get its first woman member until 2 years after the passage of the Political Reform Act in 1976, when Roseanne Vuitch was elected to the Senate. There had never been a woman in the Senate until that point.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the notion of politics as a Wild West kind of, you know, fight it out backroom scenario, people weren't comfortable with that anymore. They wanted some sort of parameters around how the game is played, some rules that would go with it.
I can remember, not while I was here, but members that would talk about how campaign contributions were made in cash. I assume they went into the campaign kitty, but I don't know that. But I mean, there was much less disclosure and transparency than has been a consequence of the law change.
It was a Wild West, and I think people today would just be horrified knowing that, you know, you could just give campaign contributions as much as you want. Nobody knew who was funding both candidates and initiatives, and elected officials could have jobs with businesses or get paid by businesses, got paid for speaking, got gifts, were wined and dined, and no one thought anything of it.
But seeds of change had been planted. In California, a realization began taking hold the system needed to change to better serve the voters rather than the politicians. The game changer came in 1974 with one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history, Watergate. The corruption, tales of slush funds controlled by the president, organized criminal activity, and of course, the cover-up led to calls for sweeping change. As usual, California led the way as something called Proposition 9, the Political Reform Act, worked its way from idea to ballot to voters overwhelmingly voting to make it the law.
Well, my appreciation for the political reform question really went before Watergate. It happened when I filed my first report after having run for the Community College Board in Los Angeles in 1969. And the accountant who had worked in political campaigns throughout California, was very prominent, prepared my campaign report. And the names would use the first initial and the last name and scrambled the names and didn't put the amount next to the name but only an aggregate. And I said, well, that's rather strange. And he said, no, that's the way we do it here and in California. And so I looked at the code and I saw the code says accurately describe each, the identity of the contributors or the sources and the expenditures. And so as I looked into it, it seemed to me very clearly that the true name should be there. And at the same time, as I've read other reports from the Secretary of State's office, I noticed vague committees, the ABC committee, the Good Government committee, that you didn't know where they came from. So based on that, I asked my father, well, I looked a little further. I saw an Attorney General's opinion that had legitimated or had given the interpretation, yeah, this is the way we do it. It's all right. And my father was Attorney General. So I asked him about it. I said, Dad, this doesn't make any sense. This is the statute, and your opinion seems to water it all down and make it toothless. And he said, well, let me tell you. I was talking to Earl Warren about this very thing, and he said, Pat, this is the way we do it. And if that was good enough for Pat Brown and good enough for Earl Warren, It should have been good enough for me, but it wasn't.
Well, in addition to, I think, what was a generalized feeling that there should be much greater transparency, much greater full disclosure of campaign finance, who was giving the money, who was getting it. What excited a lot of activity was Watergate. And Watergate, of course, had occurred just before '74. It was wholly apart from the immorality of the act, it was in colossal, incredible stupidity. I mean, if the Republican campaign chairman had called Larry O'Donnell, the Democratic chairman, every afternoon at 4:30 and said, "Hey Larry, what are you guys going to do tomorrow?" And if Larry had told him, it wouldn't have made any difference. But it made a tremendous difference in that it excited people enormously. It led to not only, well, I'll put it this way, it activated an impulse that I think a lot of people had had for some time.
Well, I think, you know, people really, Watergate helped enormously as people's eyes were really opened at the federal level about what was happening and how corrosive this was. There were groups around the country, and certainly here in California, Common Cause, the League of Women Voters had been fighting this. And it was really sort of the progressive community that was like, this has got to stop. You know, fortunately, you then had Governor Brown for his first term, who said, you know, okay, we can do something about this.
After Watergate, people were sending letters, calling, upset about the issues to Congress, as well as obviously in California, where there was change by initiative.
But of course, you know, living through the Nixon years as a kid, and you know, but certainly paying attention to politics, I mean, I thought that they were awful. That's why I went into journalism, to write about it.
The big thing, of course, was Watergate. And the Watergate scandal was in full flower in 1974. The second factor was that Jerry Brown was the Secretary of the State, and he exploited that atmosphere, the concern about political corruption, to sponsor the Political Reform Act simultaneously with his run for governor in 1974. And there was he raised the specter of special interest influence in Sacramento and the Capitol, and he was going to go to the Capitol and clean up things, and he was going to limit lobbying influence over legislators with limits on how much they could spend on legislators. And so, I mean, it all kind of came together in 1974 in that sense.
The leader of the Assembly called me in, and there were 11 legislators there, and they put me on the hot seat. Why was I doing this? What was my authority? Didn't you know that this was very bad, or something to that effect? So from that, and I was Secretary of State by this time, I decided to do the Political Reform Act. And Dan Lowenstein worked for me. He drafted it. We worked at it together. And then at some early point, Common Cause came along. And even before that, the People's Lobby. And this was the tripartite group that put it on the ballot. And of course, by the time we got it there, it had already been Watergate and all the revelations that came out. So it became quite timely in 1974.
Passage of the Political Reform Act required public officials to be accountable for a sweeping array of campaign disclosure and ethical standards in public office. In order to enforce the act, the Fair Political Practices Commission, or FPPC, was created. The 5-member bipartisan commission seeks to promote the integrity of these standards in California through fair and impartial interpretation and enforcement of the campaign, lobbying, and conflict of interest laws.
Well, absolutely, and again, I think that, you know, it's been a long time, but a sense of re-empowerment, that the Political Reform Act suggested that we can take back the government and that we can take back the process, and maybe that's even more important, the process rather than taking back the government. That again, the elections should be the people, should be a way for the people to express their preferences. So, so you move from this kind of disillusionment and this recognition that all is not well, that the process hasn't been working the way it's supposed to be, but that there is an answer, and that we do have an initiative process, and that the people can intervene and change the rules of the game in a more fair fashion.
The thing that's the greatest benefit of the Political Reform Act has been the level of disclosure.
Some of the most positive effects of the Political Reform Act are the Commission itself. You know, there is a body that is here, 4-year terms, and so depending on the proclivities of the chair, they can get really tough and remind people, you know, you need to behave. You can't just quietly break the law because we're watching. And that watchdog function is absolutely critical. And it raises the bar on everyone's behavior. And I think that that's really important, because if the watchdogs weren't here, the law could say one thing, but people will do something else. And you know, the bad folks will always be bad, but the folks that come in and they just get swept away with the whining and the dining and all of that, they can become much more sensitive, and it sets a floor that this is the way you behave and this is the way you're expected to behave. Ideally, you also behave according to the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law, but at least the letter of the law is the floor.
Well, I think that's principally it, is campaign transparency. So even though some try to hide it, and it's good when the FPPC goes after those folks, but mostly we know who contributes, how much they contribute, when they contribute, and so at least informed and interested voters have an opportunity to learn about that.
The Political Reform Act is meant to be a floor, right? I mean, it's meant to be, here's the sort of the minimum ethical conduct we expect of you. We expect of you to tell us what your financial interests are. We expect us to tell you where you're getting your campaign contributions from. You know, we expect you to not vote in a way that affects those interests. But sometimes you sort of have to remind people that, yeah, but that you know, there's more to ethics than that. I mean, just because it's not, you know, it's clear that it's not okay to take a loan from your staff member, you know, but maybe it's also not okay to not treat your staff member with dignity and respect, right? So I think it's always important to remind people that the universe of ethics is not just the rules that are in the Political Reform Act.
Importantly, the Political Reform Act established the FPPC. And so while there had been campaign finance regulations in the country for many years prior, almost since the founding of the country, there was never an enforcement mechanism that was meaningful, that was going to make people feel that they had to comply with these rules. And suddenly, having a mechanism like the FPPC and on the federal level the FEC was really a significant change.
The most positive, it's a symbolic stake in the ground that that dictates principles that people running in elections and elected officials have an obligation to disclose information about their own interests, that there are limits on how much money can be contributed to campaigns, there's disclosure. So it's really, I think, more than each of those individual pieces, there's a collective statement that there are limits, and that, that no one is above the law.
It's no surprise in the realm of politics that opinions vary, and that's true when it comes to whether the Political Reform Act and FPPC have and are doing what the spirit of the law intended. Unintended consequences, changes in the political and national landscape, all have an effect on the outcome.
There was SB 34 and Prop 34, which further expanded it, that requires internet disclosure of campaign contributions in almost real time, and that's all good. That's all good, but it all, it stems back from 1974.
When we ran Proposition 208, which was the last big campaign finance initiative to pass before Prop 34 destroyed it, we had a section in there that prohibited fundraising in non-election years. And I had lobbyists who called me and said, I will never say that I said this, but thank you, because you have so improved my life, and I'm not hit up. And we can just focus on the policy.
The negative part of it is that we put these limits on, and then you get the independent expenditure committees, and you get this money rolling in. We still don't know, as much as the FPPC has tried, we still don't know all the money rolling in from independent expenditures. So that's a real negative. The positive is we do know a lot more than we used to.
So I don't think it's really diminished special interest influence. It just moved it in different directions. For example, when we put some limits on direct campaign contributions in California, although not as strict as they were at the federal level, what did it do? It moved everything into the independent expenditure category and in effect drove it underground. You used to be able to say this group of interests gave this money to this politician and this is what this is all about. But if you shift it into independent expenditures, you're divorcing that cause and effect relationship. The politician can say, I didn't have anything to do with it. That's an independent expenditure. And so in a way, the proliferation of campaign finance laws, particularly those of the limits, have driven the commerce of special interest influence underground.
The Political Reform Act hopefully stops bribery, misuse of power, misuse of influence. Unfortunately, you see that doesn't always stop it, because human nature being what it is.
Those changes include two decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court which have significantly changed the political playing field. The Citizens United and McCutcheon cases both deal with issues regarding disclosure, campaign donation limits, and much more. Money as free speech, and what that now means for the overriding issue of political reform and campaign finance, and for democracy itself.
Well, I think that it's clear that the Supreme Court's decisions are leaving very little in political reform. But what remains, and what has steadfastly been supported by the Supreme Court in every one of their decisions from before Citizens United all the way through to McCutcheon to this day, is disclosure.
I think it's a very dark road. I am so dismayed by the Supreme Court rulings around Citizens United, the one we just had, where you can't limit how much an individual gives overall. And sort of the increasing role and the power of corporations over the power of people. It might be free speech, but they have a gigantic megaphone with all of those kinds of dollars, and that just turns the average voter off.
I guess the real answer is for the Supreme Court to say that money is property, not speech. Then you could put a limit on the amount of money that can be contributed. But until that happens, money is going to find its way in legislators' bank accounts, political bank accounts, and they're going to react accordingly.
Well, the traditional test is that you can regulate speech in the campaign context of spending if it would eliminate corrupt practices or the appearance of corruption. Now, at least there is the appearance of elected officials being overly influenced by campaign donors. And I guess people would argue about to what extent there's more than the appearance. But certainly restrictions qualify in that way. And I'm disappointed that justices, or at least a majority of them, felt otherwise. And I hope someday those sentiments or majority opinion will change, but I just don't know. It's a long haul before it does.
You know, the Supreme Court has said repeatedly that money is the equivalent of speech. So long as that stands, then the only thing we have is disclosure. And so the Political Reform Act is drives so much of the disclosure in California. And disclosure in California is pretty good. It's pretty good. It's pretty widespread.
Well, I hope that, the FPPC will continue to be strong enforcers of the Political Reform Act, particularly in this era when we have unbelievable loosening of the campaign finance laws. We really need a body that's standing up there, not just enforcing the law, but really talking about the need for figuring out new ways that we can institute campaign finance reform that really works. Because as people see this money pouring in, they just figure the political process, it's corrupt, I don't have a voice, and they become disengaged, and that's really dangerous for our democracy.
In the years since California voters approved Prop 9 and created the Political Reform Act and the FPPC, there have been a lot of changes here and across the country in the world of campaign finance, lobbying, and conflict of interest. So what will the next few years or decades hold? What kind of changes might we see, and what role will technology play in this realm? Opinions, predictions, hopes, fears all vary, but our esteemed experts all agree on one thing. It's the old saying, the only constant is change.
I think as we move forward, we're going to see such changes in the way technology is used for campaigns that the agencies that are regulators in this arena are going to have to change with the times and look at those new technologies, how they're being applied, how they're being used, and make sure that we still get robust disclosure.
I think that in this technological age, there are better ways to do what we do. The system that's maintained by the Secretary of State's office is renowned for its clunkiness, for lack of a better phrase. In the world capital of technology, we ought to be able to do a better job of gathering that information and presenting it to the public and the media. If we in the media have a hard time navigating through all of the paperwork, although it's supposedly electronic stuff, to find out what we want to know, you can imagine how difficult it is for the general public that's not even halfway familiar with the process. We need something that's user-friendly, complete, timely, and I think enforced by fairly severe penalties for failure to comply with reportage requirements. To me, that would be the way we ought to go, and part of that is making the system much more user-friendly than it is now.
I think the public is so cynical, they think that all politicians are crooks. And that's my email all the time. They're all crooks. They're all, get rid of politicians, that sort of thing.
Right.
And what I usually tell them is that politicians are pretty reflective of the public as a whole, that the system works pretty well, because the people get elected pretty well I don't know if they represent, but they reflect the people who elect them. You got good people, bad people. There's some excellent politicians here and some real crooks also.
I think just from everything you've seen in the last elections, we have to figure out a way that we can stand up and say corporations aren't people. And people have the power to vote, and we have to encourage them to vote, because the vote is the one thing, actually, that corporations can't do.
I think that it is an American trait that we have never trusted government. I mean, that's why we have the Bill of Rights. We never have trusted government, and I don't think we particularly should. Individuals can do great things in government. Certainly agencies can do important work, but no, we've never trusted government. We're never going to trust government, nor should we.
I think that the mere passage of the act and the statement that came from that was so important symbolically and politically that it's important that we retain the act as a whole. Again, recognizing it could be improved upon, but the general thrust is important.
Having more openness, it is true, sunshine is the best disinfectant, and so it's good to just keep trying.
I would say people might look today and go, oh, but you know, we just had this scam, you know, we just had these huge problems in the legislature, but minor compared to what it used to be. I think the Political Reform Act has made a huge difference, and it needs to be continued to be massaged. You know, you have the regulated community constantly complaining, oh, it's so complicated and there's so many regulations. Well, frankly, if the regulated community didn't keep trying to find loopholes around the law and the regulations, then there wouldn't need to be so many regulations.
It was, I think, a useful exercise. What it did not do, and will never do, there will always be people who are dishonest, who try to cheat and try to beat the system.
So I would have to say, with regard to political reform, that education, that example, and that the fundamental principles of an ethical society have to be at the heart of enforcing and advancing a more ethical political regime.
Are the campaign finance rules and regulations way too bureaucratic and confusing?
Well, as someone who is still in elected office and subject to audit, I guess I should say no comment.
Is campaign finance rules way too bureaucratic and confusing?
Sufficiently so that we're going to have to end this interview because I've got to get in there and submit before the deadline the donations that I've made to political candidates.
With that, thank you very much, Governor.
You bet, Jay.
Do you think campaign finance rules are way too bureaucratic and confusing?
You know, they're ridiculous.
No comment.
I would have absolutely no comment on that.
No comment.
Yes, but I don't want to comment on that.
I'll emulate a politician and say no comment.